Welcome back, everyone. I'm so excited to be with you here today. My name is Janice Malillo, the host of Stories That Inspire Us. And of course, we are also simulcasting through the Wisdom audio app. So I want to thank everyone on Wisdom currently hopping on. I just asked my Wisdom audience before we were, when we were in the process of signing on, do you like baseball? We're going to have a great conversation about baseball. I am certainly no expert by any means. Okay, so I want to make that very clear. I think maybe I played t-ball when I was little. I'm not sure if that qualifies now as baseball, but in any event, I have an amazing guest on today. Let me tell you a little bit about my guest on. He is a writer. He is a podcaster, the Baseball Lifer podcast.co. And he is, Don, please correct me if I am wrong, the only broadcaster in the minor leagues who is blind. Welcome to the Stories That Inspire Us podcast, Don Wardlow. Don, I am so excited to get this conversation going with you.
It's a pleasure, Janice. And to be exact, I was the first. There is another. He's in the majors, by golly, and he's blind. And along with broadcasting the games of the Tampa Bay Rays in Spanish, in the daytime, he works in the public defender's office. He's an interpreter. So somebody who can't afford a lawyer and the courts appoint one for him, if he only speaks Spanish, this gentleman does that in the daytime and he broadcasts the games of the Rays at night, and he's blind. So I was first, and he in fact worked with me when I needed desperately help with the Spanish language to do interviews with some of our ball players.
Wow. I know what the first obvious question is going to be, but before I ask that question, who is your favorite baseball team?
Oh, I've been a Yankees fan for a good many years.
Oh, no. And I'm cracking up because, as you know, I'm from Connecticut and from New Haven County, typically toward New York. You're a Yankees fan. And even though I am in New York and New Haven County, I am a Red Sox fan, or you're
that can happen,
Yeah.
It's open country. It can be Yankees, Mets, Red Sox. And now with the internet, anybody can root for anyone, no matter what part of the country they live in.
That is so true. So I have to ask, obviously you love baseball, so much so that you became a broadcaster. Don, how is that possible?
Well, I had a play-by-play partner, Jim Lucas, and Jim and I met in college because I knew I needed someone to do play-by-play. The story goes back to 1979 because I'd been a fan since 1971. And I've been listening to the best of the best, the broadcasters for the Mets and the Yankees. And these guys, those broadcasters are mostly now in the Hall of Fame. And even Boston had Ned Martin, who belongs in the Hall of Fame, but he's not there. I hope one day he gets there. But when you hear the best of the best, you don't think that you could do that for a living. So early on, I wanted to be a disc jockey. I wanted to play country records in particular. But in 1979, I was twiddling my radio dial and I discovered college radio in the high 80s and low 90s on the dial. And luckily it was a Saturday and there was a college baseball game being broadcast. It was a Columbia game against Iona. That was my first taste of college baseball. And by twiddling the dial, I could hear Seton Hall and I could hear Fordham. And I got the idea, hey, these guys are only a few years older than I am. They're making mistakes like regular people, mistakes that Hall of Fame broadcasters don't make. And if these guys can do it, when I get to college, I can do it if I can just find someone who will do play-by-play.
Wow, that is so inspiring that you took your love of baseball, and obviously being blind is a disability, but you didn't think of it in that way. You just said, this is something I'm going to do, but I'm going to do it a little differently.
And part of that was made possible my in between my first 2 semesters of college, I got my first seeing eye dog. And I can tell you something, getting a first seeing eye dog can only be compared with a sighted person getting their first car, because a whole new world opens out in front of you when you get a seeing eye dog, like you must have felt when you got your first car. You freedom, freedom.
Mhm.
So, and with the seeing eye dog, these marvelous heavenly creatures called girls who used to ignore me, suddenly they were coming up to me and saying, "Oh, what a cute dog." And one of those became my first college girlfriend.
Oh my gosh.
And
Oh
if you
my gosh.
if you can do that with seeing eye dog, you get to figure you can do almost anything. So I went over to Philadelphia to take in a boxing match. I went into Philadelphia for a concert once or twice, and I started to go to the college radio station. I had to get a license at that time. That's not required anymore. But I got to I got a hold of a list of all the guys and one girl who wanted to become sports broadcasters on our college radio station. And one by one, I asked them, and even the girl said no. I thought we'd be a great combination on the air, a young lady and a blind man. I mean, imagine the publicity we could get. But
Mhm.
she wasn't having any of it. And the last guy at the bottom of the list was a guy named Jim Lucas. And really, the only reason he was the last guy on the bottom of the list was I couldn't find him. I'd found all the others. I'd asked them all, and they'd all said no. And I had left messages for Jim at the radio station, which he never returned. And I found out over a long career of working with him that he didn't ever return messages, and he still doesn't, even 40 years later.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
so I got a 5-minute scoreboard show. I'd get on at 8 o'clock at night, and there'd be some games underway already, and I'd say whatever else was on the schedule for the rest of that evening. And to make my broadcast different, I had a boxing report every week on my show, and I would talk about whatever boxing matches had happened during the past weekend and whatever boxing was scheduled for the following weekend. So one of those Tuesday nights after my scoreboard show, I came out of the studio and I heard a very familiar voice, a man I'd been leaving messages for. And he said, "Hey, Don, nice job." And those are 4 words that changed my life, because I knew that was Jim. I'd tape recorded him doing a baseball game and a basketball game, and I didn't have a lot of tapes to play with. So I listened to his 2 recordings, repetitiously. I mean, when you don't have but a couple of tapes to play with, what else can you do? So I
Mhm.
knew his voice as well as you could know anybody's voice. So very quickly I said, "You're Jim Lucas." And no doubt he stepped back several feet. And he told me even then that he wasn't used to being recognized just by a handful of words. And I said, "Jim, there's something that I'd like to talk to you about, and I'd like you to come to my dorm room, and I want to talk about it in some detail." Well, he had nothing better to do, so we walked over to the dorm. We got into the dorm, and he said, "When I was a freshman, I lived in this dorm." And I said, "Well, that's cool." And we turned down the hallway where I lived, and he said, "I lived in this hallway here." And finally, we got to my room, and Jim said, "Don, I used to live in this room."
Are you kidding
And
me?
I knew two things. Well, for one thing, he carved his initials in the wall, which he told me about. And 2 things I knew. One was this is something special. And the other thing I knew was where the pizza boxes and beer cans had come from when we first checked in.
Oh my
So,
gosh, that's so funny.
so we we talked a bit, and obviously he turned out to be a big baseball fan. And I said, "Are you up for a challenge? Would you broadcast baseball with a blind man?" And he didn't take as long as you might think to think that over. And he said, "Yes, I would." Now, right then it was basketball season. So I said, "Well, we should really start with basketball since that's what's going on now. And at this station, everybody does everything." So now the guy in charge of the station was none too happy. And what Jim said was, "Here's what we'll do. We'll make a tape recording of our next basketball game, which would be our first one together. And at the same time, we will record the game your broadcasters are doing. And if we're not as good as they are or better, you can tell us that and we'll go away. And you'll hear from us again next year." Well, we went to this next game, the next home game that Glassboro played. That was the college, Glassboro State, which is now known as Rowan. And so we went there, we broadcast the game, we made our recording, we made the recording from the radio station, and we turned over the 2 sets of tapes to the man in charge. And he said, "Well, you guys can do a game together."
Wow, thank you so much for for really sharing that story, because I don't believe in coincidences like that. It was meant to happen that way, and your persistence in tracking Jim down, and then of course recognizing his voice. He goes to your dorm room, which happened to be his room. Like, you just can't make that stuff up.
Yes, you sure can.
Wow.
So
So now you're working with him. So let me ask this question. So now you're working with him and you're broadcasting. So he's giving you some information and then you add to it. Am I understanding that correctly?
right, he would do the play-by-play. He would cover the things I couldn't see.
Gotcha.
And now at the college level, there wasn't a whole lot I could add, but I tried to add something, some kind of color commentary. Once we became professionals, there was more, that I could add, but that's a different chapter of the story. But initially, we would pretty much be 2 guys, talking about the game. He would broadcast the parts I couldn't see, and I would try not to step on his territory. And I try to add whatever I could. But with no internet, remember, we didn't have the stats readily at our disposal as announcers today have. So it was a lot more difficult at the college level to do what we did. And then after we did basketball, then we did baseball, then we did another season of basketball. Christmas of '84 was our first big road trip together. We went out to Marietta, Ohio for a college basketball tournament. So I came back after the tournament, went back to college, only to find out that Jim had quit. Well, I was devastated. I didn't think that anybody would want to broadcast with me with Jim gone. But there had come a new crop of announcers into the radio station. And because they were new, they weren't getting experience on the air. The time was going to the seniors and the juniors. And as rapidly as I could find these newer people, I would say to them, "Hey, this is what we'll do. I can record a game with you on tape if you do the play-by-play, and then you'll have some experience. And when the station is ready for you, you'll be ready for them." And there were several different young guys who took me up on that, and I continued to broadcast either on the radio or on tape. The games still got done, and I kept getting my experience, and I kept helping these guys get their experience. So even with Jim gone, I was able to keep going, which was a big, important thing for me.
Wow. So now you're out of college. You already have established your groundwork. You have the experience. You've worked with different people along the way, obviously Jim, of course, being the first. When did you get to the minor leagues? Like, how did all of that occur?
Well, Jim stayed out of my life from the beginning of 1985 until July of 1989. And in late June of '89, he called me and said, it's me. I'm back in New Jersey. Would you like us to get together and do a game at Yankee Stadium? And I'm like, well, of course I would. So we took our tape recorder and we did that, and that was fun. We figured it was just a one-time fun thing, and that was July of '89. The next winter, February, Jim called me again, and he said, if you could get all the broadcasting equipment you needed and you didn't have to worry about the money, what would you ask for? And I pretty much knew what I would have liked to have, but I had no budget. So I told him what I'd like to have. And he came over and he brought me a bunch of this stuff. And he says, Don, I want to know if you're up for a challenge. I want us to do some basketball now and baseball later in the year, just onto a tape recorder. And I want to make demo material, demo tapes. And I want to send a letter to every baseball team that exists. At the time, there were 176 baseball teams. He said, I want to send one to every team and see if anyone will give us a tryout on the radio. And if it doesn't work this year, we'll do the same thing next year. So in the fullness of time, I found out why this all happened. His first marriage had gone wrong. And so he wanted to get out of the collection agency business, which is what he'd been doing since 1985. And he wanted to become a professional baseball broadcaster. Well, I was working at a company called Recording for the Blind, and I was doing quality control for cassette books for students. And, that paid the bills, but that's about all it did. So, of course, I wanted a shot at becoming a professional baseball broadcaster. And so we did some basketball, and we made our first demo tape based on our game from Yankee Stadium from the last summer. We made like a 4 or 5 minute demo tape. We sent that, we packed that up. Jim wrote all the letters. And one night we had a letter signing party. We got some pizza and beer in my apartment, and I signed 176 letters, one to each team in baseball, major and minor leagues. It's worst case of writer's cramp I ever had in my life. So we sent those out, and we waited. And we waited. We got, I'm going to say, 30 form letters. Not interested, computer printed, no, that's it. We got 13 relatively decent handwritten letters that still said, we're not interested, but, keep trying. And we got one positive response in April of 1990. And the man's name on the bottom of that letter was Mike Veck. Now, baseball people know the name Veck because Bill Veck, Mike's dad, was the power behind Disco Demolition Night. And Disco Demolition is an event that some people know who weren't even baseball fans, because in a protest to the disco movement of the 70s, there was an event where you could bring in a disco record, and you could get in for 98 cents, and they would blow up all the disco records in between games of a doubleheader. They figured they'd been getting maybe 10, 15,000 people a game. Well, for this promo, 40,000 people were there at White Sox Comiskey Park, the old ballpark in Chicago. And they blew up the disco records, which is wonderful. And it's a great thing. It shouldn't have devolved the way it did. It went wrong because these 40,000 people in their jubilation over disco being blown up, they stormed the field and they were cheering and clapping and jumping up and down. And while they're doing that, they were tearing up the field. Well, Major League Baseball folks, especially umpires, have zero sense of humor. And it was clearly not going to happen that they were going to be able to get the crowd off the field. And so the umpires declared a forfeit. The second game of the doubleheader was automatically given to the opponent, to the Detroit Tigers, I think it was. So there was, of course, a lot of terrible publicity, which Bill Veeck took all that bad publicity, even though the idea had been Mike Veeck's idea. He kind of protected his son so that his son, would be able to carry on. Well, we had seen the name of Veeck when we were signing the papers, and we didn't know that that was Bill's son. And so when we got that positive response and it said Mike Veeck, I'm like, this is the guy. If there's a guy anywhere that'll give us a chance. His father blew up disco. If he has any of his father's foresight, he'll give us a shot. And we had a one-nighter in July of 1990. In the following December, we went to the winter meetings. In February, Mike Veeck said, as Johnny Olson would say on The Price is Right, come on down, because his team was in Pompano Beach, Florida. So we were only too eager to get out of New Jersey in the cold weather and live in Pompano Beach, Florida. And that was the beginning of a 12-year career in different cities broadcasting minor league baseball.
Wow. I absolutely love this story. Your persistence and love for baseball certainly shines through, and not taking no for an answer. And even with receiving, all of the reject letters, and then receiving that one letter.
Oh, Jim had to be the tough one to receive the reject letters and keep going. He did. He was a tough cookie too. So it took a lot to discourage Jim. So he kept going, and we waited, and we got that letter that we got came to us after we had done a boxing show. I wanted Jim to have a little taste of everything. I wanted to see whether he would faint at the sight of blood if we did boxing. And so we did that into a tape recorder. We split up at midnight that night. I got a phone call at 2:30 in the morning, which at that time, I was young enough and I was still wired because we'd done the boxing show. So I answered the phone at 2:30 in the morning, and it's Jim, and he says, Don, it's Mike Veeck. I had a letter from Mike Veeck, and he's going to give us a chance to come down there in Florida in July. Wow. That was the beginning of it.
Wow, that is amazing. I want to chat about your podcast. Tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Okay, well, I've been a guest panelist on another podcast going back to 2021. But that show, it's a good show. I'm still on. I'm still part of the panel. But it doesn't really focus on baseball. And baseball is the sport I know the best, except for women's basketball on the college level, which they don't talk about that much, unfortunately. I tried to encourage them to do that, particularly to talk about my Connecticut Huskies. I've been a rooter for them going back to 1993 because I lived in Connecticut for 4 years.
Oh,
yes, I did.
I didn't know that.
I lived and worked in Connecticut with the New Britain. At first they were the Red Sox, then they were the Rock Cats, the Twins AA team. So, and when I left, it was difficult to follow the Connecticut Huskies for a while until the internet came along, until I got my first computer, and I've been able to follow the Huskies ever since, and I still do. So, but as I say, this show didn't focus that much on sports that I wanted to talk about. So I talked to the host of the show where I am a panelist, and I said, Bob, I don't want to step on your toes, but if you'll give me your blessing, I want to start my own podcast strictly about baseball. And so he said, go for it. And he connected me up with Pinecast, which is the company that hosts my podcast and makes it possible to put it out on the air. And the first couple of shows, I didn't have any guests. I hadn't built up, any kind of a guest list early on. So the first couple of shows, I just talked about different things that had to do with baseball. And then I started to find guests, and then I got on a list called Podcast Guest Directory. And from that, I was able to get a bunch of guests. And I find other guests as I work on Facebook. And and others have been friends of mine. And so what has developed has been usually between a 30 and 45-minute podcast with one fellow. Later today, there's going to be a special edition with 2 college baseball announcers. We're going to talk about the upcoming College World Series. I think this is the first time. Oh, no, there was one other show where I had 2 guests. There's a podcast called Michigan and Trumbull. It's about the Detroit Tigers. And that has 2 hosts. And I invited those 2 guys to do an edition of my podcast.
Wow.
So week by week, I sort out who's, going to be on and what we're going to talk about.
Wow, that is just so amazing. And I'm just in awe of what you've accomplished in your life. And then I know that there are so many other things that you have yet to accomplish, and you will get there, no doubt. I want to go back to the Red Sox versus the Yankees for just a moment here.
Certainly.
First of all, I didn't know that you at one point were living in Connecticut. So, and I'm certainly familiar with the New Britain team in that area. What made you want to stick with the Yankees? Just very briefly.
Well, as a little guy, I initially discovered baseball by way of the Mets. They were on the country music station, which I listened to as a little kid. And they had a commercial. And the song that ran the commercial was a song that went, meet the Mets, step right up and greet the Mets. And it had these banjos. And that was the kind of a song that would just grab me. And I'm like, what's this all about? What about the Mets? And so when spring training started, I listened to the Mets. And when my grandpa got hold of the fact that I had discovered baseball, well, he couldn't have been happier. Now, he was the serious Yankee fan of the family. And he used to tease me, and he would say, the Yankees have been around forever. The Mets are nothing but a bunch of beginners. Now, I didn't realize that what he was saying was gospel truth. I found out when I went to my first Mets game, they were doing a celebration for their 10th anniversary since they had begun, which was in 1962. So compared to the Yankees, the Mets were a bunch of beginners. And Grandpa was right on the money. And he told me the coolest stories about Walter Johnson and Bob Feller and Lou Gehrig and the Yankees of the 30s when he was a young man. And he would take my dad, because Grandpa worked for the railroad, and he could take his son to a Yankee game once a year. And that was a big deal for Grandpa. Dad was something of a fan, but he wasn't as much of a fan as Grandpa was. But when Grandpa passed on in December of 73, it wasn't too long after that, I got the idea to start listening to the Yankees as a tribute to him and all the great stories that he told me. And I've been a Yankees fan from then till this day.
That is amazing. Do you ever watch any Red Sox games?
Very occasionally, I try to avoid them. Um, the Yankees, they're definitely my team. The Red Sox, if they're like facing Otani, if they're the Sunday night game of the week, I might catch them that way. Of course, if they're in the playoffs, I follow the playoffs. Whoever's in them, always hoping that the Red Sox will lose if they're in the
Oh
playoffs.
my gosh.
But you know how it is.
Yeah,
And
oh, yeah, yes, absolutely. A little friendly rivalry with
right, and now I've got a neighbor in my building downstairs, and he's from Boston, and so he's always ready to give me the needle if the Red Sox beat the Yankees. So I give it back to him when the Yankees beat the Red Sox.
Oh my gosh, I love that. This has been such an enjoyable conversation. I always learn so much, but more importantly, I'm so inspired by your story, and I can't wait to see, what your next adventure will be. I hope of course, you will definitely consider coming back and visiting the podcast again. It has been my honor and privilege to chat with you, Don. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure, Janice. I'd come back in a minute.
And one other question: what is the best way? I know I have your contact information, but if somebody wanted to connect with you further, what do you think is the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Well, there's a contact through the podcast,
Okay.
and that is Don, just my first name, Don, at thebaseballlifer.com.
Awesome. And of course, I will make sure that is in the show notes. Thank you again so much. And I also want to thank all of our current listeners on the Wisdom Audio app. I see some familiar names, so thank you so much for being here today. Remember, stories are all about the inspiration and perhaps taking a disability and not even looking at it as a disability, but going forward in your life with vigor, with an honest emotion of sharing what you are passionate about. And also, if you have a story to share, you need to share it because the world needs to hear it. Be inspired and also be the inspirer. My name is Janice, the host of Stories That Inspire Us. Today, truly inspired by Don's story. Thank you so much, Don, and we shall see you all again very soon. Bye for now.